Hey guys, welcome back. So today I wanted to talk about a really important tool when it comes to hard surface designs, as well as just concepting in general. And that tool is called DynaMesh. So to show that, I'm just going to create a new project. So I'm just going to use this sphere here and just show you how that tool generally works. So DynaMesh is, I guess it's short for dynamic mesh. So if I press Shift F on the keyboard, it brings up the wireframe of the subtool that I have selected. And even though ZBrush is a sculpting tool, and we talk about it being, more like using clay or something like that, in the end of the day, it's still a poly modeling based tool. So we still use vertices, we still use polygons and things like that. It's just not so obvious as opposed to tools like 3D Coat, which uses voxels as its sculpting method, which doesn't take into consideration polygons. Now, because this is under the hood, it is a polygon modeling tool essentially. We still have to be concerned about the flow of topology in some regards. So if I just bring up my move brush, so that's BMV, and I'm going to bring up my brush size, and I'm just going to move this across. So you can see as I did this, you can see that there's a clear deformation of the surface here, and the topology is being stretched out. Now over here, the squares are relatively the same. And then over here, they're all stretched out. They're more like rectangles, right? And that becomes a problem when we start to sculpt. So if I make this even more obvious, and let's just keep going and let's just keep pulling like this, you can see that we get this really bad artifacting effect. Now, if I press Shift F again to take my wireframes off, you can see that even more so, especially up here and up here. Now, what most people would do in this case is subdivide the mesh, which in a lot of cases that can be okay. So the hotkey for subdivision is Control D. You can also find that in your subtool geometry palette in your tool palette here on the right, and it's this button. So you can see I have two subdivisions. I can press this button again, I can go to a third. And that will smooth this out as much as it can. But you can see that because this is such an extreme case, that artifacting is just not really going away. And it's only when I go up to about 5 subdivision levels that it sort of starts to get a little bit better. Now, the reason why we want to keep this in mind as well is that if I brush over this area, and I'm using a pretty high subdiv level, so 5, so I'm looking at about close to 3 million polygons, it might not be so obvious, but if I bring up my cutting tool, so my damn standard, which is BDS, and I just make a stroke on my mesh like this, it's not so obvious, but what you can see here is that we have a fairly nice cut. Right, it's nice and clean. We can change this to freehand, which gives it a bit more, gives it a nicer sort of effect, maybe. Not really. We need to do a bit more adjustment to that. But the point here is that you can sort of see as we get to the areas where we really moved that mesh across and didn't do anything to fix it. It doesn't matter how many times I subdivide this area, it's still not optimized for this type of detail because the topology is so stretched out. And I can see it here as I sort of zoom in. You can see that they are indeed still stretched. So we do want to keep that in mind. Now, there are many methods when we're sculpting to sort of fix this. But it's sort of, the method that you would probably use is called Z-remesher, but that can take some time and it sort of breaks up the flow of your concepting. So what most artists use is something called DynaMesh. You can find that in your tool palette on the right under geometry. And it's just over here, about halfway down. So DynaMesh, just going to open that up. There's a few things in here, but the main thing that you want to look for is the DynaMesh button itself and your resolution. So if I enable DynaMesh, which is on this case, this model has it already DynaMeshed. Just going to bring up my wireframes. What I can do is then move things around. Let's say I want to move my the mesh around using the move tool again, just like that. And instead of just leaving it like that, I want to make sure that I DynaMesh this object before I continue. And if I had it off like this and turn it on, it will automatically DynaMesh like you saw there. So I'll just do that again. Just pay attention to this area here. And let's just try to make that a little bit more obvious. So just try to do something like this. So you can see that when I DynaMeshed, it just fixed this area up for me. Right. It's not perfect, but it's done a pretty good job. Now I can smooth that out by holding down Shift and just continue sculpting. So we're sort of not worrying at all about the topology, right? So I can continue pulling all this out and getting the shape that I want. And then when I get to a point where I think I'm stretching it out too much, because you can sort of visually see that it's getting a little bit distorted here, I can just DynaMesh. Now, to DynaMesh a mesh that's already in DynaMesh mode, all I need to do is hold down Control and drag a little box in the open space, and this will trigger DynaMesh again. So this is a great way for concepting because it can work really, really fast and not worry at all about how the topology sort of looks, and we can just focus on the design. When we get to a point where we feel like we're stretching it too much, or it's hard to sort of work with, we can just drag a little box whilst holding down Control and fix that up. Now I want to stress that DynaMesh is not really a final tool. Like, you wouldn't want to take this to the final stage. It's very much a really awesome concepting tool. I wouldn't finalize a model with DynaMesh because the surface is a little bit messy. It doesn't matter how high of a resolution you go, it does get a little bit messy. Now let's talk about this resolution business. I'm just going to start a new project here, and we can bring up the wireframes. And what I'm going to do is just copy this subtool. So I'm just going to duplicate that and bring that over. And we can see that we have two objects here. One is the same. So what I'm going to do is just DynaMesh these at different resolutions. So let's increase this to, let's say, 340 or 320. And let's DynaMesh that again. You can see that the squares are really, really small, right? As opposed to this one, which is at 664 resolution. If I scale this object all the way up and just bring that across, DynaMesh that again, you can see that we get really tiny little squares, right? So it's sort of kind of local to the object that you have, right? It's not relative to the world. So if I made this object super tiny, and DynaMesh that again, you'll probably see that the the squares seem to be a lot bigger than they were before, right? So the larger the object is, the more resolution that will seem like it would take. Right? I guess you can sort of think of it like there's an invisible grid on the screen, and the higher you go, the more of that grid that you'll take up, and that grid never changes. So it seems like there's more resolution on that mesh, right, as you DynaMesh. But when it's really small, because that grid, that invisible grid on the screen never changes, it becomes quite obvious that it's very, quite large. And that was a really, really tiny mesh. So it made it basically nothing. Right. So what resolution should you pick? I think that's kind of like one of those questions like, how long is a piece of string? I think you want to go high, but not too high. Because when you go too low, it obviously becomes too low res, and some of your details won't come through. So you just want to play around with it. I wouldn't go really high. I wouldn't max this all the way out unless I'm doing something specific. Because if you max it out, then it can get quite laggy. Now, what are all these different buttons here? I'll suggest you read the docs. They're useful, but I find them useful for very specific things. Now, if I have group on, if I was to, like, let's say, grab half of this object and give it a polygroup, which is Control W, and that's not a very good color. Let's try that again. And I have group turned on, and I press, I trigger DynaMesh. What DynaMesh would do is basically split this object, right? So it'll split the polygroups into its own own object within the same subtool. So we don't have two objects, but we have, basically two elements in the one object here, which is handy, I think, for certain use cases. I find that it's just, I'd rather not do it that way. Let's put it that way. What else is there? There's the polish, so we can sort of polish as we DynaMesh. So if I was to, let's say, do something like this, where I just do a little bit of sculpting, and you can sort of see that it's getting a bit faceted here. I can DynaMesh that, and it sort of does a clay polish, which is nice because it sort of does a pretty good job at keeping the corners. So if I turn that off, it sort of mushes that up a bit. You can sort of see that. But if I keep it on, it does a good job at keeping things nice and tight. So might be useful to have on if we're doing some hard surface sort of sculpting. Most people would sort of leave it off because it can work really well sometimes it doesn't. But in this case, it's working pretty well. So I might just leave that on. The blur will just sort of soften some areas out. So it's not too sharp. Blur is just blurring something, essentially. So if we were to get really harsh here, we can increase that blur to max it out, and it basically just softens it all out. Which is, useful in some cases. More often than not, I just don't touch this. The picker will allow you to pick the resolution of other sub-objects or subtools, the resolution anyway. So if you want to match the resolution of different subtools, you can use the picker. And the projection basically will project on surfaces. So if you have another object underneath, when you DynaMesh, it will basically project the mesh onto that surface, which can be useful in some cases. I don't normally touch any of this. There's other ways to sort of create shells, which I tend to use more. And I generally don't touch this sub, add, and which is a Boolean method. Right, so DynaMesh is super powerful. Let's talk about what else it can do. So if I was sort of moving things around, let's say I'm just doing things like this, and I want to bring this object back in on itself, or I sort of want to, let's say, connect these two guys together for some reason, right? I can do this where I'm just making them touch like that. And if I toggle DynaMesh, it will fuse this area together. So it's a great way for doing quick Boolean operations, where you're just sort of connecting things together and so on. So you don't have to worry about whether things are connected or not. Now, the DynaMesh works really, really well with a tool or a brush called, or your IMM brushes, which stands for Insert Mesh or Insert Multi-Mesh. You can find them in your brush palette. So there are these ones here. So if I press I on the keyboard, it'll bring them all up or isolate them. There's one that I typically use with this, and it's your primitive ones or your standard ones, which is somewhere around here. There's too many to look at. But your primitive ones work really well with this. And it's just your primitive shapes. You basically have a high and low poly version. So just a BIT, so brush, insert, multi-mesh, primitive, right? So we can insert things like cubes and so on. So I'm just going to start a new project. So let's say I have something like this and I want to scale this down. And let's say I'm going to bring this up. Just do something like this. And if I wanted to do some quick Boolean operations here, I can enable DynaMesh. Maybe I'll keep polish turned on, right? So there's multiple subdivisions here. It's asking me if I want to freeze. I could say yes or no. I could just delete the lower if I wanted to and just continue. And then I can continue with what I was doing. So I can come into here and let's add a cube. So nope. Okay, and I can click and drag out these cubes. I can hold down Shift to sort of keep it in a straight orientation. But what happens when I do this is that you can see that when I insert that mesh, the original mesh becomes grayed out. So it becomes mask essentially. So in this mode, what I can do is press W to bring up my move tools, and I can move this shape around. And just do my general sort of moving around. If I wanted to, I can separate this mesh. So right now it is currently part of the same subtool. I can go into where it says split here, open that up and split unmask or mask points to make it a separate tool. But the power here is that if I, let's say, add this cube somewhere. So let's say I add it here and I scale this up. So I do something like this. Now, of course, I can come into here and use my deformation, my modifiers here. And let's see, let's use like a taper perhaps. And let's see if I can taper from here. Something like that. And what does this one do? I want to get that a little bit straighter, so I might do this. Great. Press this little gear icon to accept that. And accept. What I can do here is that in this mode, with this still masked out and in my DynaMesh, if I was to DynaMesh, so press Control and DynaMesh, it will do a Boolean operation. Now, I kind of did this wrong. So it will add the mesh. So you can see now this mesh is fused together. Like that. Which is not really what I wanted. But you can see I can quickly add meshes together like that, which is pretty cool, right? Pretty great way of just adding detail. Now this still works because I can just come into here and use like my clipping brushes. You can see it was a quick way of adding this detail here. Now there is like a little weird part with the clipping brush. This is, I'm diverging a little bit here, but it still sometimes adds this weird plane. So what you got to do is just mask out this area, invert that, then use that clipping, or clip this first. Then mask that part out. Invert that. So we want to grab that little part there, invert that, and try that again. So not always the perfect way of working here. Might have to try my trim brushes. That works, or I could try and I think that works. Then fix that up quickly using my clip curve. Great. So we've got a nice hard edge there, right? And a little bit of cleanup, but that's okay. So I'll just come into here and just do the same sort of thing. So I'll go through these brushes in another video, but you sort of get the idea here, right? To subtract when we're doing the IMM brushes is we want to hold down Alt as we drag these things out. So if I bring up my brush again, so IMM or T, and let's say I come into here and I want to subtract something from this mesh. So let's say I subtract a cylinder. So we want to make sure that we're in a brush and not in the not in our move gizmo, because that will replace it if we put the IMM brush in. So we want to make sure we're in a brush first, IMT for our insert cylinder, and then we can insert a cylinder here. Now, instead of pressing Control, right? Sorry, not Control. Instead of just not pressing anything, if I want to subtract from this object, I need to hold down Alt as I drag this out. You can sort of see it's created this weird mesh, and it's hard to kind of tell what this is. But basically what it is an inverted cylinder. So the normals are flipped. So it's kind of hard to tell what it is because it goes all black and it goes all weird like this. But it is there, right? You just got to trust that it's there. So I'm going to move this into place. If you find that this is a bit hard to see, what you can do is go into your tool palette on the right and then go to display properties and then show double-sided. So you can sort of see how that's looking a bit better. And then if I was to then DynaMesh with this inverted tool here, it will create a hole for me. So a really cool way of working. You can see that there. I think it does a pretty good job, especially when you're sort of like concepting things out. You can easily sort of get certain shapes that you want quite quickly. Right. So that is the DynaMesh tool or feature. I don't think there's much else to sort of talk about here. DynaMesh is what it is. I think if you need more resolution, so if you're doing sort of cuts and things like that, and you find that you're not getting the right resolution, so it's looking a little bit blurry, just increase that resolution. I wouldn't go nuts with that because it can, it can get laggy, right? So it's a great tool, but it's not without its faults, right? And also keep in mind that it's a tool where you want to keep it at a concepting level. Like it's not a tool that I'll go final with. Although you can get pretty close, I don't think it's not really meant for that because it's sort of you get a lot of artifacts and things like that with the mesh itself. So generally you want to go for a cleanup phase where you clean all this sort of stuff up.